Welcome everybody. My name is Pablo Suarez. I am affiliated to the Pardee Center. I'm also working with the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement and other organizations. And as you heard, this seminar is about microfinance for food and development. Many things are happening. What has happened before hasn't been too good. There are still too many poor people who go hungry. And so we want to use this time to explore ideas and trends about what we know from the past and what we see in the present may shape the future. We are fortunate to have Anne Helwege, adjunct lecturer in international relations here at Boston University. She also taught for 2 decades at Tufts University, also a research fellow, senior research fellow at the Global Development and Environment Institute. Her research focuses on anti-poverty policies in Latin America. Being from Argentina, anything that has to do with researching the economy out there, my deepest respects to you. She's co-author and editor of books on Latin America, the economy and agriculture, and her work has been presented at the World Bank, at the International Labour Organization, at the Federal Reserve, and other places where decision-making happens. She holds a PhD in economics from SUNY Buffalo. Next to me is Marjorie Victor. She's senior policy advisor at Oxfam America, the private sector team. Oxfam earned a reputation of being very much principled and sometimes confronting the private sector. Now there's more work in trying to work with the private sector to find solutions for the poor. She currently leads Oxfam America's initiative in microfinance, especially microinsurance, and also is leading the Oxfam international work on this sector. She has engaged with multinational corporations in a variety of disciplines, mostly for pro-poor development and human rights. She has established strategic alliances with a number of entities, especially socially responsible investors. Before Oxfam, she worked with Indochina Capital Corporation, with Harvard Law School Fund, so there is some diversity in the background. And she completed her studies at the Fletcher School, and she also did the academic work at Amherst College and the University of Geneva. Myself, in addition to Pardee Center, I'm with the Red Cross, Red Crescent Climate Center. Our work is bringing science to the humanitarian sector. I'm also consulting for the UN World Food Programme, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, have worked with the World Bank Development Economics Research Group on microfinance in Malawi, especially insurance, and I'm very eager to learn from my fellow panelists and especially from the conversation that awaits. Anne, let's start with you.
Many thanks to Adel and the Pardee Center for hosting this, and I'm just delighted to meet the two of you. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say, so I'll try to be brief. I thought I would just set the context for this conversation about poverty, food prices, and microfinance. Since we're all into inaugurations right now, and since the Pardee Center is focused on the longer range future, I thought I would drop back a little bit to FDR's inaugural speech in 1937. So here's a quote from it. "I see millions of families trying to live on income so meager that the pall of family disaster hangs over them. I see millions denied education, recreation, and the opportunity to better their lot and the lot of their children. I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, and ill-nourished. And if you look at photos from that period, it's pretty obvious that there were a lot of hungry people in the Depression. So that would be 70 years ago. 35 years later, in 1972, this is when I was graduating from high school, we had already had the GI Bill, and I took for granted that anybody could go to college. It was cheap. Who could not go to college? We had many good public universities. We had housing subsidies for the working class. Many people expected that they would be able to afford a home. I would say that my parents were not from a class that was considered at all elite in the 30s. Very, very, very touch and go for them. We had Social Security. I remember hearing stories that without Social Security, elderly people have been reduced to eating dog food, that the elderly were the poorest segment of this population in this country prior to that. And we'd already been through Brown versus the Board of Education. We'd already had the Voting Right Acts of 1965. We had affirmative action in civil service. This was not bump-free progress. We certainly had George Wallace, we had the KKK, we had deaths in Montgomery and Selma, but there was noticeable progress by 72. And 35 years later, exactly, 2009, we celebrate our first black president. Young people say to me, "What's the big deal that he's black?" I'm like, what? And we have a belief that every person in this country is somebody we as a country care about and want on board because we're a stronger nation with everybody on board. Not something that I think was the dominant belief 70 years ago. We also take for granted that malnutrition or undernutrition in this country is something for us to be ashamed of. And here's something I think kind of sums up a national attitude about food. This is from FRAC, the Food Research and Action Center. Hunger reduces a child's ability to learn. It decreases workers' productivity. It weakens an elderly person's resistance to disease. It weakens families and prevents our nation from reaching its full potential. I think that is the U.S. attitude toward hunger. We don't have very many people who suffer from severe malnutrition. We are embarrassed by the people who go to bed hungry at night, and there are not that many of them relative to our population. So what's the parallel on the global front? Well, in 1971, again dropping back that couple of decades, Robert McNamara commented that as the president of the World Bank, that we could eradicate world hunger at a cost of only $8 per child. And in 1974, the UN hosted the World Food Conference in Rome and said, within a decade, no child will go to bed hungry, no family will fear for its next day's bread, and no human being's future and capacities will be stunted by malnutrition. The food production goals of that conference were met. The goal of reducing undernutrition was not at all met. And in 1996, there was another food summit hosted by the FAO. It set the goal to reduce undernourishment by 1/2 over the course of 20 years. But in the first 5 years, there was no progress. And in the early 2000s, 1998 to 2002, the number of people malnourished increased by 5 million per year. More recently, the increases have been astonishing, in part because of the rising price of food. The FAO estimated that 40 million more people were undernourished in 2008 than in 2007. Remember that this was a strong global economy until a few months ago. So this is a relatively good period in the world economy. And at this point, 963 million people, or close to 1 billion people, are undernourished. That's 14% of the world population. This is not for lack of food production. As of 2002, world food availability surpassed daily per capita levels of 2,800 kilocalories and 75 grams of protein. More than enough. We produce more than enough to feed the world. Nor is this increase in food production limited to the developed countries. Between 1974 and 2004, per capita food availability in developing countries increased by 24%, and proteins by 32%. What FDR said in 1937 is, we've always known that heedless self-interest was bad morals. We now know that it's bad economics. In listening to Barack Obama, I think we've also learned that it's bad for national defense. So yesterday he said to the people, and I believe this was not because he's some bleeding heart liberal, but because he cares about security and our welfare as well as the welfare of the rest of the world. To the people of poor nations, we pledge to work alongside you to make your farms flourish and let clean waters flow, to nourish starved bodies and feed hungry minds. And to those nations like ours that enjoy relative plenty, we say we can no longer afford indifference to the suffering outside of our borders. Okay, so that's our new president. So let's start looking at the problem, some data, and hope that we can make real progress in 35 years, and maybe in another 35 years have your grandchildren say, "What's the big deal? Who would go hungry?" So just looking at poverty data, the most recent revision of poverty data by Ravignon, who is the big poverty guru at the World Bank, 2.8 billion people live on less than $2 a day. That's 54% of the world population lives on less than $2 a day. 1.1 billion live on less than $1 a day. We're making slow progress. Between 1993 and 2002, the number of people living on less than $2 a day declined as a percentage of world population from 63% to 54%. Bottom line, more than half of the world lives on less than $750 a year. Okay. Where are they? 75% of the poor in the world live in rural areas. And in rural areas, the depth of poverty is much greater. 70% of rural people live on less than $1 a day. The share of the poor who are living in urban areas and slums, for which we see a lot of pictures on the television, that share is increasing, but it's only 26% of the poor live in urban areas. Okay, and it's increasing relatively slowly. So from 1993 to 2002, the share of the poor rose from 24% to 26%. I happen to be a Latin Americanist. 60% of the poor in Latin America live in cities. That is not the case globally. Globally, the poor are in rural areas. Where are they? 65% live in 7 countries: India, China, the Congo, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Pakistan, and Ethiopia. Okay, so if you put together India, China, and Africa, you're looking at 70% of the malnourished people in the world. 2 minutes. Okay, be fast. Okay, so how are these families affected by food prices? In a World Bank working paper in 2008, here's a quote. Many low-income countries are net food importers. The importance and potential impact of their net food importing status, however, has been highly exaggerated. 2/3 of low-income countries, 2/3 of developing countries are net food importers, but 2/5 are agricultural exporters. So here's a kind of neoliberal perspective on the impact of food prices, and I'll try to be quick about this. According to this article, 22 out of 32 countries that don't export oil are agricultural exporters. Thus, food prices, quote, would on average improve the trade situation of many low-income countries. Same line of argument, fairly simple. Most poor are rural, many poor, 90% of the poor are smallholders. If you increase the price of food, they're going to be a lot better off because what they sell has a higher price. So Pulaski from the Carnegie Endowment argued that an increase in the price of rice is progressive, that the poorest see a gain of 4 to 6% in their incomes from a 50% increase in the price of rice. puzzling, because even the IMF says that this year 100 million more people fell into poverty. So we've got World Bank, we've got the Carnegie Endowment saying, increase in food prices should help people who produce food. A little bit more complicated than that, and I think we will come to wanting these real-world stories to help us move forward. The FAO studied 9 countries, and it found that 3/4 of rural households are net food buyers. How could you be a rural poor person and be a net food buyer? Well, in fact, the rural poor engage in a lot of activities, only some of which are food production, only some of which are even agricultural production. Especially hard hit are the landless laborers. So wage labor even on farms gets hit pretty hard, according to the IMF and the FAO. Why? Because the wages do not increase as fast as the price of the food that they're buying. Okay? Of course, in the long run, if we model this equilibrium to equilibrium, in the long run, those wages are going to increase because their employers are earning more money. In the long run, they're going to be better off. But as Keynes said, back to the 1930s, in the long run, we're all dead. So what are the answers? Just to speed up a little bit here. We know that the landless poor are hurt. We even know that smallholders, because they do not produce enough food to feed themselves and rely upon wage labor in addition to their own production, we know that higher food prices hurt them. What are some of the answers? Well, what can developing countries themselves do? There is an enormous movement toward conditional cash transfers, direct subsidies to the poor, give people cash. Unfortunately, the amount of money involved in these things is trivial, less than 0.5% in almost every single case that I've seen a CCT. Less than 0.5% of GDP goes into CCT. It's very hard to raise the money for it. Provide school lunches and breakfast. That's what we do. Unfortunately, there are not schools in many of the more remote areas for the rural poor. Provide more equitable access to water. Provide better roads to rural areas so that people can sell their goods. Provide agricultural extension services so that yields increase. Provide better marketing. Provide better storage facilities for grains. Provide more agricultural credit. Now that would seem, since we're just to lead into the microfinance idea, why don't governments do this? Why are we counting on Oxfam, this other place from the UK, right? The UK and America. Why doesn't government do that? What we know about many decades of experience with agricultural subsidies is that government subsidies of credit tend to have very low interest rates and tend to then depend upon funding out of taxes. They're not self-financing. They tend also to go to elites. The poorest rural households do not get those subsidies. And it tends to be very directed toward particular crops rather than encouraging more diversified lifestyle set of sources of income for the poor. So microcredit has some really big advantages. It aims at a very diversified set of incomes among the borrowers. It does tend to get outside of the urban areas and outside even of the smaller towns in rural areas. It can be on a much smaller scale. The payments tend to be smaller and more frequent. It tends to be linked with deposits so that the poor can do some savings. Enforcement efforts tend to rely upon peer pressure, not just some government official that you can blow off. So what we have found over the last 20 years is this is a really great alternative to government credit. Obviously, we need to do more, and we have to come back, I hope, at the end to questioning what's the role of the U.S. It's nice that President Obama cares about this, but how do we facilitate more of what you folks have been doing? So.
Well, thank you, everyone. I'm very happy to be here to talk about our work in Ethiopia, which touches your talk set up our work very well because you lay out, the major issues and why Oxfam has decided to work in this area. One of the things that we are very concerned about is climate change. As an organization focused on food security and poverty, we see climate change as potentially the largest risk to food security on the planet. So we have decided that this is our top organizational priority, and we're looking at climate change adaptation and are focused on rural producers. As Anne mentioned, 75% of the world is rural agricultural producers. So, and in Ethiopia, that number is actually 85%. So we have started a pilot in Ethiopia called the Horn of Africa Risk Transfer for Adaptation Program, or HRITA. And I will be talking about HRITA in a moment. One of the reasons that we decided that we need to focus on solving food security in country as opposed to somewhere else is that even if you had, with climate change, Canada, Russia became the breadbaskets of the world, it would be still too expensive to transport that food to Ethiopia. So people have to solve the problem in situ. And how are we going to do that? Well, microfinance, we think, is part of a very complex solution. We can't talk about all of the different parts of the solution, but I'll just focus on the microfinance piece. Microfinance is related to this question in two ways. First, food security starts with farmers and having enough food produced on the land, having a good yields and good prices. Now, farmers are essentially investors. An investor is someone who takes some surplus cash or money that they have now, they invest it in something that they think will produce something later, and then they get a return. Well, farmers who are very poor have a very difficult time coming up with that surplus that they need to make the investment. And in contexts like this, credit can be incredibly important and critical. So for instance, if a farmer wants to invest in high yield seed or a drought-resistant seed, that might require some money. And credit can be the essential path to getting that credit that they need. And in Ethiopia, the Ethiopian government, I would have to say, I applaud their policies on microcredit. They required in 1996, when they established the microcredit industry, that all microfinance providers must serve the rural poor. And this has created a massive transformation in certain parts of the country, and especially in Tigray, where we work, which is in the northern part. 70% of the borrowers of the local microfinance organization in Tigray cite access to microcredit as the reason for an improvement, a significant improvement in their livelihoods over the last 10 years. So I think that's very encouraging. However, with investment, you always have risk. And unfortunately, agriculture is probably the riskiest endeavor you could undertake. You not only have risk in terms of the price. You don't know when you harvest your yield, you have no idea what the price is going to be. And some people, they're planting trees like a coffee plant. It takes 4 to 6 years for that tree to mature. Do you know what the price of gasoline is going to be in 4 to 6 years? I mean, you don't, right? So this is very, very risky because by the time your harvest comes, you may be in a very different situation. The other problem is that you have yield risk. Drought, pests, disease, all these things can come and wipe out your crop, and then you have lost your investment. So agriculture is so risky that lenders tend to be very afraid to lend to farmers. And this means that they may lend, and in the case of Ethiopia, the government requires them to lend. They may lend to farmers, but they'll often do it at a high interest rate because they've got to cover the default risk. The other problem is that farmers don't want to take on the loans. They'll say, well, it's great. You want to give me credit. I love that. But, you know, if I default for reasons that have nothing to do with me, that I cannot control, then you're going to come and seize my cow or my ox, and then I'm even worse off because now I don't even have a way to plow my fields. So we have a problem where credit is very constrained in highly risky situations. The other thing is, you know, Ethiopian farmers, there's a study by IFPRI that showed that Ethiopian farmers are probably the most risk-averse farmers in the world. They did these like crazy experimental games and found this. So we're saying, well, look, you know, if credit is so important, how are we going to get farmers and lenders to feel more comfortable about taking on those loans? We think that there are two ways that you could do that. One is to deal with a price risk problem. Right. So price risk management is very complex, and we don't really have time to talk about it today. But the Ethiopian Commodity Exchange was just established in April, and it still remains to be seen how successful that's going to be in practice, but it's an incredibly important step forward. This is a way that farmers can lock in prices months, even years in advance. And so they know that if I produce my maize, I'm going to get a certain price. And, you know, and that's just a huge step forward. And this kind of goes to one of the points that you were making about, you know, farmers being net food buyers, and also even though we think prices are going to be high prices are going to be good for them, it's not necessarily true because you have a lag time in production. So even if the prices are very high, you might not be able to rip everything out of your field and plant something new for the higher priced goods. The other problem is even if there was one case where in Ethiopia, people had enormously good yield, but because there was no price mechanism and no good place to absorb all of that yield, the prices collapsed, and then farmers didn't even go through the trouble of harvesting the yield. Something like 30,000 tons were left rotting in the fields because it wasn't cost efficient to harvest it. So the second piece that I want to just mention is that you can also deal with yield risk through something called, well, we're trying through microinsurance, weather index insurance specifically. And the Harita pilot is working with the insurance industry, Swiss Re, which is a large reinsurance company. We're also working with local insurers, local microfinance providers, and NGOs to develop an insurance product that would help deal with drought risk. And this would be, it's affordable, very simple. It still has a lot of hurdles, so stay tuned. We'll see if we can actually overcome those. But if we're successful, we think that microinsurance can be integrated into existing risk reduction programs that are focused on food security and climate change adaptation. And we think this is going to be quite promising, and I'll give you just two pieces of evidence to show why. First is there's a program in Ethiopia called the Productive Safety Net Program. It's a conditional cash transfer program where farmers are paid in grain or in cash during the hungry season to reduce their risks. They are asked to for example, plant trees, which helps reduce the temperatures in the area, reduce runoff, improve soil fertility, and so on. And it has been shown that this program is far superior to other food security programs because it is predictable. The farmers know ahead of time that for 6 months of the year they are going to be paid for these programs, and they've shown that it's superior in terms of asset accumulation, nutrition. The children go to school. Farmers access more health care under this Productive Safety Net program. So the defining feature, as I mentioned, of this PSNP, Productive Safety Net program, is the predictability. The motto of the PSNP is predictable cash transfers for predictable needs. I think that microinsurance could be the predictable transfers for unpredictable needs. And so it could be a very interesting complement, and we are currently exploring how microinsurance could be integrated into programs like the PSNP or other conditional cash transfer programs. Then the last piece of evidence that I'll give is from the famine of 1984. for anyone who, I know there's some young students here, but I hope most people remember that up to 1 million people died in the famine of 1984. And recent research showed that that famine was not due to a massive drought. There was not a massive statistical anomaly in the rainfall. One of the major causes of that famine was that there were many small famines before, many small droughts that had happened before that year. So by the time the small drought of 84 came, people's coping capacities were so eroded that they couldn't deal with even a small reduction in yield. The other things that they found were that the aid that had been coming before was highly unpredictable. You know, people knew, okay, well, you know, somebody in the government's going to help somebody. Maybe my village might be helped, but I don't know when, where, why, what form. And so many people were selling off their productive assets because they didn't know if help was coming and when. By integrating microinsurance into the risk management framework, this is by definition ex-ante risk management. You know that if drought comes or whatever you're insuring, if that happens, you know ahead of time you have bought the certainty of an outcome. Right? So we believe that microfinance and specifically microinsurance can help provide greater predictability, ex ante, foster greater resiliency to small shocks. And by starting now, in 30 years when yields are down 20 to 40% because of rising temperatures, people will have a greater cushion to be able to deal with these shocks. So we really look forward to reporting on our progress in this project, and I'm happy to talk about the details in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Marjorie. I would like now to step away from the field work that Oxfam is innovating with and try to reflect on the role of knowledge and the role of the future in this business of microfinance for food and development. 3 key themes I will address. One is climate, another one is technologies, and the last one is institutions. And I'll start with an example that I hope you find entertaining. It continues to be, for me, the most hilarious example of climate change adaptation. CARE had a project in Bangladesh, and they learned in working with one of the communities that was getting flooded more frequently than before, that they were very concerned on the food security side because their chickens, when the floods came, were drowning. And though the people who survived did not have chickens, they were hungry, the roads were blocked, people couldn't come and provide food. Not good. They thought they had bad luck over the last few years with so many frequent disastrous events. But when they learned that the climate is changing, that scientists are saying that we should expect more of these extreme flooding events, they started discussing what should we do about it. And one of the women, often good ideas come from the ladies on the field, one of the women said, how about replacing the chickens with ducks? Water rises, the duck floats, food is there, they can have meat, they can have eggs, while humanitarian organizations think about response. I learned about this, and I saw the photo that my colleague from CARE showed me of a very happy Bangladeshi woman with her flock of ducks. When I went to work in Malawi on a Red Cross project, we explained climate change, we went with the meteorological department to a subsistence farming village. By the way, you're in charge of my timing, please. Oh. Okay. And they learned about climate change. Then I showed the example of the ducks from Bangladesh. They said, that's a great idea. We are also getting flooding more and more. We thought it was bad luck or divine punishment. Now we see what you're saying. We see that people elsewhere are having the same problem, so we want to do that. Then we brought filmmakers to middle of nowhere, Mfunga, Salima district, Malawi. And these filmmakers taught farmers how to operate a video camera, how to come up with a script, how to formulate a story and make a video about what they are doing to adapt to climate change. In my second workshop with these farmers, the workshop was disrupted by ducks walking around my feet. And the farmers are now making money by selling ducks to neighboring communities. which can only happen because of access to small credit. We made a video of this, farmers made a video of this, and now the Red Cross is disseminating these and 5 other concepts, including diversification of crops and stuff like that, by taking a little video projector to the communities and showing the ducks and other stuff. This is one heck of a good idea, I think. What are the elements? 1, we know something about the future. Science is telling us something, that the climate is changing. We can anticipate certain things, not only in the remote long term, in the longer range future, like Pardee likes to call it, but also for more imminent things. El Nino may affect the chances of drought or flooding in certain areas. Hurricanes, intense flooding, even no rain over the next 6 days. We have more knowledge or more reliable knowledge about what may happen in the near or long-term future. And that should be integrated into the decisions of food producers and food consumers. In terms of shock prices, which Anne referred to, if we know that there was a drought in Australia that reduced the supply of a certain grain, and therefore prices will go up, that knowledge of the failure, or the knowledge that a failure in Australia is more likely because of El Nino, should trigger action in those places where food will become too expensive, be it rural or urban. And so we can be more aggressive in providing microcredit or other forms of financial assistance to those who are likely to go hungry if we don't act. Another area is technologies. The duck story can only be successful in terms of replication because now we have the ability to go with a camera that costs $1,000 or less, edit with a laptop that costs $1,000 or less, burn DVDs that cost $1 or less, and take it out. And that's technology. Technology has not only been remarkably in its progress in terms of information communication, which, by the way, cellular technology, mobile phones we can use for farmers to tell other farmers where prices are good or bad for what they sell. And that's one of the things that Oxfam is considering for exporting, oranges if you're irrigating your fields. Training, if you want farmers to be better producers, you need to tell them what this new seed can do. That takes talking to farmers who are illiterate, who cannot read and learn by reading. Monitoring situations with all these satellites and remote sensing, we can detect what is going on and what's likely to happen. And then there's also, I think we should call it the technology of the financial sector. There's improved modeling, there's improved capacity to innovate in the kinds of financial instruments. For example, what Oxfam is embracing with index insurance. Index-based insurance is the kind of insurance that doesn't give you money when you suffer, when the insured thing gets damaged. Index insurance is based on the event that causes damage. So if you're a farmer and you are at risk of drought, normal insurance here in Iowa would be my crops failed, an inspector goes and determines that indeed it's failed, and someone gives the money. If you have farmers with only half an acre, it's too expensive. What you can do is have a weather station that measures the rainfall that is representative for the region, and if the rainfall is below 400 millimeters needed for germination, then you know that they couldn't have good crops. And then you can send out the money for payout. This is technology. There's also cell-based banking. There's in Malawi a project that is bank on wheels, essentially an ATM on a truck, which, because farmers are illiterate, it works with their thumbs for recognizing who is the owner of the account being accessed. This can help, and we should be tapping on the awareness that all these technologies are growing very, very fast. How are we going to try to solve food insecurity? How are we going to promote development if we know that cell phones, satellites, scientific models of climate are improving at this pace? And finally, the issue of institutions. At the global governance level, we know that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is working very, very hard in trying to secure mechanisms not only for dealing with the causes of climate change, Kyoto Protocol, reducing emissions, CO2, and so on, but also with the consequences of climate change. There has been a decision for an adaptation fund, which is eventually expected to grow into the billions per year if things go as they should go. And there has been an explicit mention to insurance. Now, insurance can work for macro level, but it can also work for the little farmer who goes hungry. So there is likely to be institutional mechanisms, including funding mechanisms, to support the development and implementation of these ideas. Civil society, a lot of institutional innovation happening. There's a lot of Grameen Bank-like organizations flourishing. And also in terms of partnerships, there is change in how academia is relating to government. There is change in terms of how humanitarian organizations are relating to international UN-type organizations. This change in attitude, the awareness that we have to cross borders in terms of sector, like government, academia, etc., borders in terms of disciplines, climate science, financial sector, anthropology, communication sciences, as well as, let's get the answer. This is pure evidence that technology is everywhere, isn't it? And there's also crossing borders across geographic scales. We have a global problem that requires some level of action at the household level. How are we going to take messages from the United Nations Conference of the Parties to the farmer in Burkina Faso? Well, organizations like the Red Cross, Red Crescent have this existing infrastructure that goes from global to local, but we lack the knowledge. There's essentially two people, my colleague Martin and myself, who know about climate change and have a mandate to deal that within a Red Cross movement that has 186 countries and 100 million people. We need more academia, right? So what do we need? I would submit that what is needed is, first of all, aggressive innovation. We need to be much more risk-taking in trying things, some of which will fail. And that should be okay. If we don't try a lot, we won't figure out the good ones. And innovation has to be at the level of pilots, local or regional or national or global. In terms of partnerships, how are we going to work together? Oxfam has been working with Swiss Re. Oxfam is working with Columbia University. This is great, and it's new. These institutions don't really know how to work with each other. There's, of course, the need for more resources, not just money, but also human resources and training, and also knowledge management. What happens with what we learn? It usually stays within the little branch of the Grameen Bank. No, we need to pull it together. In this context, academia has a lot to do. First of all, researchers, scholars have to do more learning by doing. We can't wait until it's happened to assess, evaluate whether it was worth it or not. We have to be part of the process of implementation if we want to learn. Another thing is that there should be within academia more learning for doing. So far, unfortunately, I think there's too much of this idea of the scholar somewhere else observing the world. And now the knowledge that is generated by academia with partners should be for the direct purpose of improving food security for development. So now the question is, what next? What can go wrong? What should we be paying attention to? Let's open it up. Listen to you and your comments and questions. There is a microphone over there which will not amplify the sound but will help record the audio for the video that will be available via web.
Well, my name is Hasnat and I'm very fresh from Bangladesh. And incidentally, I was living close to the Grameen Bank headquarters in Mirpur. I have no comment about first lecture because I came late, and that is again technology problem of the MBTA. But as regards the second lecture, it's a definitely very neat, beautiful lecture. I have a small comment that the 1984 famine in Ethiopia, not largely because of the food production or the shortage of food supply, but Colonel Mengistu, the then head of the state at that time, was engaged in a bloody war with Eritrea. And the war was related to the access to the port, Massawa, which eventually solved by United Nations, making sure that the both countries will get the access. But if they would take the initiative a few years earlier, then perhaps the tragedy of the famine could be stopped. And as regards Pablo's lecture, well, Pablo is my friend for last 10 years. And when he visited Bangladesh, I drafted his Bengali questions. One small point is missing, Pablo. That is the institutional. You talk about climate change, you talk about technology, and talk about institutional. Recently, the Bangladesh, there was an election. It was a very peaceful transformation from military-backed government to democratic government. And Muit, who has become the new finance minister, in the first day he introduced, which is called TCB, Trading Corporation of Bangladesh, which will operate parallel to the market. So the access to food in the market, not always because of price, not always because of supply, but because of the ill mechanism of the market itself, which makes the poor people unable to enter. So if the government can work along with the market to make sure that market is operating and poor people are getting access to food at a reasonable price, then I think that is also an innovation in the institutions that can be very good. And I believe that is all about. One small comment, again, within the first speaker, I do not know whether she has already mentioned or not, that even under a very optimum situation of microfinance and the receiver of the finance, okay, the result may not be always very happy. There are, even under normal circumstances, the debt equity ratio is negative. How we are going to address that situation? Thank you.
Let's invite more comments or questions before we bring it back.
Hi, I'm Mikael from the Pardee Center, and I have a question maybe for Marjorie on the microfinance and microinsurance. Where does the money come from? So when you're saying we provide microinsurance, who's paying for that? And then how would you scale that up if in the case it's donations?
Okay, I have a question. I'm a biology major, and I actually know very little about this, and it's really interesting hearing becoming more knowledgeable about this. But I guess what I was wondering was that it seems as if globalization has caused sort of more hunger and poverty in the world, and so maybe that's incorrect, but from what I gather, like as time continues, globalization obviously occurs, and more people are not being able to provide food for themselves. So is using more technology and sort of continuing, like enabling them to become more globalized, sort of a solution to this problem, or are we like curing the disease, or are we just kind of helping the symptom? I don't know.
Hi, my name is Sevan. To add to that point, the first speaker said something about how there's been a large increase in the amount of people going hungry, even before the recession hit. And it seemed like there wasn't really a cause and effect. And then we also talked about how these people, they survive on like $2 a day. Are those US dollars? And if so, doesn't the weakening dollar affect them a lot more than they would, say, us? So when you have discussion about inflation and whether or not, who does it help? It's good because like we sell more stuff, we're capable of getting more imports and exports. Isn't it in the long run still hurting the poor who survive on $2 a day? Thank you.
I propose we bring it back to the panel first. Anne, would you like to get started?
Sure. Why don't I pick up that question? The issue of the U.S. dollar and just some cause and effect stuff. No, it's not just the U.S. dollar. In fact, if you're interested in how do we measure poverty, the World Bank has done a huge amount of work on what's called purchasing power parity estimates of incomes throughout the world, counting not only income earned but cash or in-kind payments received, imputed rent to owner-occupied huts, fairly complicated analyses. And certainly that is not in U.S. dollars, that is in PPP dollars, very serious attempt to account for fluctuating exchange rates. Be happy to talk with you afterwards about that. In terms of understanding the cause of hunger, I really think that this is an interesting puzzle for the theoretical economists who sit far away, who don't get out and talk with people who are in the field. It's very easy to say, 3/4 of the poor are rural, so since they're food producers, they must be helped by an increase in the price of food, and we can run some fairly sophisticated models on that. The models, unfortunately, don't take into account the lags between when that market does better and when wages actually increase. So any of you have worked in a job where you know the business is going well, doesn't mean your wage goes up that fast. And then the second thing is, although smallholders could jump into that market, right? We see a price increase, we could jump into that, but you have to have access to the seeds in order to change crops. If you've been producing something that hasn't gone up, now we'll produce rice or wheat. You have to have access to the credit. You have to have access to the land if you're going to expand your production. You have to have the technology, the knowledge of how to do it. So I think we oversimplify when we sit back and we do our complicated models about how prices affect the poor. So rural people, in part because they are almost all, except in some places like Vietnam, almost all of them are net food buyers. They are very much hurt by a rise in the price of food. So I'll leave it at that, let you pick up some of the other questions.
Well, first, I'd like to make just a quick clarification. Pablo, you very kindly gave me a promotion in your introduction of me, and I meant to say something. So I'm not the lead, Oxfam International lead for financial services. It's the Oxfam International Private Sector Team Financial Services Working Group. So that's the OIPST FSWG. And if you can say that, I'll give you $20. In any case, so just a couple of things to answer your question about where the money would come from. Ideally, the farmers pay for the insurance themselves, because we think that when farmers pay for it themselves, it's much less likely that there will be these perverse incentives. So you see, like in Florida, people build $7 million homes in the floodplain because the government is basically paying for their flood insurance, or they're subsidizing it. You get perverse incentives that way. However, cash is a major constraint for farmers. And the other thing is climate change is increasing the risk to really unsustainable levels. So how are farmers supposed to be expected to cover these really high risks? This is a question we're thinking about very carefully, and I think there are two answers. First, one thing that we're looking at is having farmers be able to pay in kind. So there have been studies that show that farmers, if they're asked to pay out of their pocket for health insurance, they would only pay 3 Ethiopian birr. But if they're allowed to work it off, they'll pay up to 14 Ethiopian birr if it's monetized. So that's already one way of getting around it. Another is that it could be a blend of subsidies, but not on the actual pure risk, but maybe on the access. So you subsidize the creation of the weather infrastructure to do the actuarial analysis, the distribution costs, all of these things. But you want to make sure that you're not sending a signal to the market that producing X crop is less risky than it is, because you're subsidizing the risk. So that's how we're looking at it. And where that money would come from, it could come from climate change adaptation funds. So this proposal by AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States, is saying, give us money for risk reduction, insurance, and compensation for non-insured risks or non-insurable risks, and that money could come from a climate change adaptation fund, or some of these other food security programs that are already being funded, but doing risk reduction, and you just add on the number of days that people work. That's one idea we're exploring.
The CDM, that's
that's
CDM
another.
process connecting the conditional cash transfers to CDM money
Sure.
for climate change.
Sure. Farmers provide, or,
Deforestation.
people are providing these environmental services and they should be paid for it. I don't cut down my forest, so you pay me for that. Another, okay.
Before you move on, if you answer the question, forgive me, but if I, thank you. He asked you where the money was coming from, and you went into this really interesting study about farmers paying in kind, which sounds great. But if they're paying in kind, then where's the money coming from?
Right. So if they are for example, and again, this is something we're just purely at the exploration stage. I don't know if it'll work in practice, but you could, for example, the Productive Safety Net program pays farmers, I don't remember the exact details, but I think up to $21 a year. And so they have, during the sort of off-season, they're working there to reforest areas, to build soil bunds, trenches, check dams, these kinds of things that reclaim degraded areas. So they're already working that amount of time. You could... they could just basically work an extra 5 days or 10 days, and the money that is set aside for these food security programs could be increased either through like adaptation funds or through donor funds, because the donors are already, they're crazy about at least this particular program. They really think it's superior to the traditional wait until there's an emergency, then go and hire the firefighters and build the fire building and get the fire trucks, and by the time you show up, the fire is already raging. So it's much more cost effective to handle things ex ante. In fact, there was a study by the USGS that showed that an emergency that's dealt with ex ante might cost $1, but it'll be $7 if you handle it after the fact.
Just also on that question, the U.S. spends 0.17% of its GDP on foreign aid. So we can have nice inaugural speeches about caring about the hungry, but we need to ramp up a little bit. That could have a very substantial impact.
Maybe just talk about the globalization question. Sure. Did you want to say anything about the globalization question?
Oh, wow.
Is it another seminar?
That's a whole nother seminar. Well,
I have a quick
Yeah.
comment about it. To the woman who asked about globalization, the way Oxfam sees this is, yes, globalization is both a threat and an opportunity. I mean, it's basically a fact of life. You're not going to turn back the clock. We're not going back to, tiny local economies that are isolated from each other. So the best thing to do at this point is to just figure out how can poor people not only survive but thrive in that kind of world. This is just, as she mentioned, like a whole nother seminar. It's just too complex a question. But one of the things that we were looking at particularly is global policies. For example, food dumping. The United States is very rich. Pay their farmers in Minnesota to grow a lot of corn. It gets dumped on the world market, and farmers that have a comparative advantage, meaning like they've got the right kind of environment to grow stuff at a very cheap price, they can't compete. They're put out of business because these commodities are dumped onto their markets. So, I mean, that is one of the biggest places to start. Look at commodity policies and
if you're interested in this subject, Global Development and Environment Institute has a lot of research on its website. So just GDAY at Tufts. There's a wonderful paper called The Promise and Perils of Agricultural Trade Liberalization. And certainly there is a mixed bag. I mean, the idea is that if you would somehow open your markets, you would get cheap U.S. food and people would be able to eat more easily. The notion is that small farmers who cannot compete will suddenly be able to go get manufacturing jobs. And again, it's a question of how quickly can poor people adapt to changing prices. And I'll also say on the flip side of that, on a globalization perspective, we have had our own barriers to taking in cotton from poor countries, to taking in biofuels from Brazil. So it has to be a two-way street. We have to be willing to face the competition from abroad as well. Pretty complicated topic, but there's quite a lot on the GDAY website on this.
Just one tidbit. They found that like for every $2 of aid for every dollar of aid that is given to developing countries, $2 is taken away in distorted trade. You know, we talk about free trade, but we only want free trade going in one direction. You know, we put up our own barriers. We don't want cheap Ethiopian coffee coming into the country.
If I may just respond to Hasnath's direct question or comment about what I said. Total agreement. Institutions are one of the aspects that definitely require more learning, more exploration, more analysis, in part because there's so much change and there's so much market failure. I think that the average subsidy by a European cow, received by a European cow, is more than the amount of money of a poor person in Burkina Faso. That's ridiculous. So if we want to start new things that have to do with microfinance, which is a new theme, which is hard to grasp, can be complex, requires by its nature a legal framework, the private sector playing a role, humanitarian sector knowing who to target, and so on. It's complicated. So we definitely need to address the institutional failure to do what needs to be done. Of course, we would want government to take the lead. Humanitarian organizations cannot wait. On Mikel's question of where's the money coming from, when I was doing the work for the World Bank, I started with the certainty that this business of micro insurance for the poor was a way for the very rich to take money from the very poor. And that's why I wanted to research this. What I learned is basically that, yes, this is true, but in the process, by providing insurance and other risk management mechanisms, the poor can grow richer. So more money is taken by the super rich, but still the poor begin to slowly escape poverty. Because of that, the global financial sector is really interested in investing in this stuff. Because if the super poor becomes poor and then somewhat poor, they can buy financial services. They can become a customer of a bank. They can buy little insurance. And so more money goes to the financial sector. So Oxfam is receiving support from, modest at this stage, but hopefully it will be scaled up by the financial sector. Let's open a second round. I saw Moeed, and then sorry, you start. Yeah.
I work mainly in health, so I know nothing about food and food security. But I'd like to know just two questions. One, how do you take the 14 birr of commodity and convert it into money so that you can pay for health services? Two, yes, it's 0.17% that we put into foreign assistance, but I don't know. But I would say from my experience, 80% of the foreign assistance dollar, whether it's bilateral or multilateral, is wasted, really wasted. It's why I'm eating lunch here on the foreign assistance dollar. It's not helping people in Lesotho. And then your comment about, for every $2 goes the other way, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not at all sure that more money is the answer. I mean, and there are thousands of examples running from this moment back 30 years, I think, that somewhat support the idea that just putting money in is really a lousy way to go.
Adil and Moeed.
Thank you. Moeed Yusuf from the Pardee Center. I think what I'm asking has probably been covered in one way or the other, but I just want to sort of reiterate that. To me, one problem with this entire discussion of poverty, anti-poverty programs, microfinance, targeting, is that you're asking countries or systems which have poor governance, which have a record of poor governance, to actually deliver perfect governance. And then all what you're saying works. So the real question is, aren't we looking at an inherent paradox here? I mean, we're going to a country where the reason for going is that governance is bad and thus, there are lags and there's market failure, and then saying, well, if everything falls in place, farmers benefit. I don't know whether that works. The second point is, I'll take off from the last speaker. I mean, my experience from Pakistan is that there is tons of money floating around in microfinance now. That's the new buzzword. The problem is not only lag time of production and prices, but the problem really is one of governance. I mean, support prices are set, they're never given to the farmers can't find place to sell their crop. I mean, there's all kinds of governance problems at multiple nodes. And how do you actually determine that this part has to fall in place before another one? And how do you put this entire chain in line for this to work? Because, I mean, my experience with microfinance, there have been positives, but there are a lot of negatives as well. I mean, people are in debt cycles, et cetera, et cetera. And do we also not perhaps exaggerate to some extent the skill level, the sort of financial management, et cetera, of farmers themselves, especially the most poor ones? Thanks.
I'm Adil Najim from the Pardee Center. Thank you for a wonderful discussion. I wanted to actually, the last two comments were exactly the ones I wanted to build on. Just to echo, I also think there's plenty of money in the system. I really don't think money has been the problem for a long time. In fact, with, again, microfinance, I think part of the problem is there's too much money. And that brings a certain type of actors. They're not bad actors. It brings large NGOs. It brings large banks. It's not that they are bad. They just operate to a different tune. And the whole magic goes away if the tune changes. But that's not my question. My question builds from Miguel's about where does the money come from, and not in a critical way, because I think microinsurance is really a brilliant idea. But trying to think about it in how it will work, and I think health is a good example. And the experience from Lesotho that you talked about, health is a good example because insurance and health are both the type of investments where you're investing against risk. We know the small farmer, we know this from the Green Revolution, which for all its bad things showed us that the farmer will invest if he knows that there is a payoff. He'll invest in fertilizer, he'll invest in seeds. He's a smart investor. Now, both health and insurance you're asking people to invest against a risk of something going bad. That's the investment that you and I make only from our surplus. It's not the operating cost of my car. It's saying I have extra cash, so I will invest it in case I am in an accident. Now you're dealing with someone who doesn't have the extra cash. So the puzzle to me is, how do you construct an instrument that to work requires that cushion when the whole problem is, that's what poverty is, that there isn't the cushion. Because if we can solve that puzzle, then I think we're really onto something. But I'd love to hear what the thoughts are of people who've been thinking about it in that lens.
Let's bring it back to the panel, and if there's time, we keep going.
Okay, couple of responses there. Putting more money into things is absolutely a lousy way to go if you don't think a little bit more about how you spend that money. And I think over the last 30 years, we have learned a lot about some alternative approaches rather than just subsidize agricultural credit, which clearly doesn't work. And actually, I would say I myself have been somewhat skeptical of microfinance as a solution, having the idea that there must be better government programs that we could use. Microfinance is kind of a drop in the bucket. What is that going to do? But when you start putting together all of the little pieces, and I have to say Oxfam is an inspiring institution in terms of just looking for a little piece here, a little piece there. So some of the ideas are raising yields through the SRI rice planting, changing. These are really small little changes, working with individual farmers to show them how they can raise yields, not with magic bullets, but just little changes in technique. Increasing water harvesting. 80% of water, of agricultural water, goes to large farmers. How do we increase the amount of water that goes to small farmers? So water harvesting is one approach. What can small farmers do? What can government do? I believe we need to work together on that. this idea of hedge funds. Who thinks of hedge funds today as a solution to anything? But remember that hedge funds were started as a way of helping farmers to deal with the fact that there's risk. They put that seed in the ground and they don't know what the price is going to be at the other end. And this Ethiopian commodity exchange, combination of governance and helping small farmers to manage risk, these are all little bitty pieces. And certainly the governance problems are substantial. But one of the interesting things about this microfinance, and we're not talking about just microcredit, but microinsurance, micro savings. Adel asked the question, where are the savings going to come from in order to pay for the insurance? In fact, the poor do save. They save in the form of cattle. They save in the form of putting that one little extra level on their house. They make many, many attempts at saving money. It is not impossible, if you can scale up, to have insurance for fairly inexpensive insurance to deal with not the drought in one particular community or pest in one particular community, but nationwide. So I guess I don't want to ramble on too much, but I guess my punchline would be, it's not about markets. We can toss out these papers that keep arguing that markets or higher prices are going to help reduce undernutrition. It's certainly not about government either. I think we have learned that. I think we have to look for these little answers, these a bunch of, to give is it Reagan or George Bush 1,000 points of light? We need to look at each of these little solutions that might help. And I think that microfinance turns out, in retrospect, to be a bigger opportunity than certainly I had expected 20 years ago.
Well, people have raised a lot of difficult issues, and I don't think we'll be able to address all of them here. But a couple of things. First, when we talk to farmers about financial literacy, we try to explain to them why microinsurance might be of interest to them. They've really started to grasp the idea of microcredit because they've seen it transform their lives. And I should say that microcredit is not going to solve everything, and there are definitely problems with it. But it's like, we use an analogy. It's like they've been trying to, they have like one or two tools, financial tools, savings, and maybe they have credit. And it's like they're trying to plow their fields with a hammer and nail things in with a hoe. They don't have the proper tools for the proper job. Microinsurance corresponds to a set of problems that they have, and they've been using the wrong kinds of tools for it. So I don't think the problem is with it's inherent in the tools. It's when the tools are pushed beyond their limits. So, farmers taking on too much risk. I mean, the Ethiopian farmers are very smart. They don't want to take on credit because they know their risks are too high and they may default. I think that's when people are pushed into taking on too much debt, or when it's not coupled with other kinds of value addition. So you're just increasing the intensity of low yield activities, and there's no market for them to actually sell or to transform their products into something that's going to capture a higher price and really be profitable. So, using any one tool in isolation and over-relying on it, that's when you start to have problems. The other thing that I think in terms of the governance question, we see that civil society, having a strong civil society to be able to advocate for their own rights. This is not a place where you just hand somebody a solution and then you say, thanks, we're really good luck, and we're going to say goodbye. That doesn't work. Things are not going to go to plan, and farmers need to be educated about the products that they're buying. They need to know what the alternatives are, and they need to have a mechanism for saying this is not working for us, and it's safe for them to do that. So one of the things that we have proposed, at least in Ethiopia, is that they create an ombudsman office for people who are dealing with microfinance issues and are unhappy with it. So the civil society question is very important. And then the last thing I'll just say about the money. How would the 14 bird be converted? So they're working in a program where they're getting cash. So in exchange for their labor. So that cash can be used to pay for the insurance. That's how you monetize it. Does that? Well, if it's coupled with conditional cash transfer programs, yes, it is scalable and it's generalizable. Look, in Ethiopia, at least that productive safety net program reaches 7.2 million people. So even if you were only working in that one little area, it's still quite a big intervention. Yeah, that's all I'll say.
Good. On Adil's question on how to make it work so that you don't depend on some surplus of farmers who don't have surplus. The pilot that happened in Malawi that I was researching for the World Bank was really, I think, a very innovative and good idea to precisely address that. Farmers are using seeds that are very low yielding. They want the better seed, they need more money to triple production, but they can't afford that. Loans are not given to them because if there is a drought, they can't repay. Now, the drought that makes the crop fail may happen every 4 to 7 years. So if you do the math, it would be worth it taking the risk because in the long term, you make more in the good years than you would lose in the bad years. So the program in Malawi, which is now in its 3rd season, is essentially bundling credit with insurance. There are 3 players. One is the farmer who wants good seeds and can't afford them. Another one is the bank who wants to make money by loaning money but doesn't want to lose it if there's a drought. And then there's the new player, an insurance company. At the beginning of the season, the farmer receives a package of 30 kilograms of seeds of the good kind, a piece of paper that says, if there is a drought, as measured by the weather station, you don't have to repay the loan. The insurance company will repay the loan. So the farmer gets the better seed without putting any money down. At the beginning of the season, the farmer has nothing. And then there's also a 3rd piece of paper that says, you owe the money to the bank, the cost of the seeds, plus the cost of the insurance premium, plus the interest, which is still quite high. But if there's a bad season, farmers get nothing, but they don't owe money. If there's a good season, they can triple production. So this is how insurance is not a product in itself, but it's the key that unlocks access to development. And that's what's needed. Now, explaining this to an illiterate farmer is not easy. I was working in Tigray for the World Food Program, which is precisely asking the question of scaling up. If it works, how do we go massive? And we created a game to simulate the process of insurance bundled with credit. And in this game, I had assumed that I could explain the prices by writing down numbers, either in Arabic numbers or in the Ethiopian alphabet. It turns out that these farmers, many of them, did not know the symbols. It's not just illiteracy of letters, it's also illiteracy of numbers. The only way to convey value was by showing the bill, showing the actual money. A red bill means 5, a blue bill means 10. And they know how to do the math. They know that if they sell 7 kilograms at 15 birr per kilogram, they make X money. They can do the math. They just don't know how to read the number. So imagine taking these sophisticated financial instruments to a massively illiterate sector. It is quite a challenge. And here comes the 3rd point that Moeed was raising. Isn't it a problem of governance? We need literacy to make microfinance work. Well, I think that the biggest problem in this is that the table where these things are being decided is packed with very relevant actors like governments, essentially, the private sector, especially the financial sector, that can find its way to almost any table. To some extent, the experts in international organizations, but there's no one sitting at that big table advocating for the needs of the really poor. That's something that Oxfam is beginning, and part of the rationale for Oxfam to engage in this pilot is to gain the moral authority to say, okay, I tried it, I know what I'm talking about. We need more prioritizing the needs of the poor, we need more investment in this and that, we need more transparency, we need more better governance, and so on. I think we should begin to consider wrapping this up. I want to highlight that the Pardee Center is carrying on research along lines that have a lot to do with this. There's knowledge and humanitarian organizations, there's measuring poverty, there's climate change issues, including energy, which is an important aspect of agricultural production, trade. We're talking about flows of money, so in a way it's trade. There's another fellow working on information and communication technologies for Africa. There's the global academia and how we make research or we make teaching in remote places through well-respected organizations from the North. There's even an idea by Mikel of doing some research on the role of games for teaching or something like that. So the Pardee Center is active in what is needed now to lay the foundation for a longer range future that is better. Hopefully there will be more, and ready.
Can I just say one thing? Because I know there are a lot of students here. And, you know, at this point, as I look back on why is the United States different than it was in the 1930s? And as I watch my retirement savings just go, I think, am I going to be on those breadlines? And in my heart, I know, no, that's not going to happen. We are not going back to where we were in the 1930s. So if I ask, well, how did we get to the point where we could be facing a really severe depression, and yet very few of us are worried about being on breadlines, the kinds of things that Dorothy Helwege took pictures of? We have made progress. How have we made that progress? It hasn't been one thing. It wasn't TVA. It wasn't just the GI Bill. It wasn't just the Voting Rights Act. It was a whole series of small things, many of which individuals devoted their whole life to just that one little thing, getting more access to water in El Salvador, a whole life of work on that. So for those of you who are in the audience who are young, you know, in 35 years, I hope you can look back and say, hey, we're making some headway. And as a dear friend who has since passed away, but was a real radical in the 40s, said in 1978 to some of my students, you know, history is like a cycle. You know, it makes gradual progress, goes up and down. But you know what? After 35 years, you can point to some progress. And I'm really hoping for the young people here that in 70 years, we can say that that 1974 goal of cutting malnutrition by half has really been accomplished. So, okay.
I think that's a very good note to end on, and to thank you all. Here at the Pardee Center, we define the longer range future as 35 to 200. So the fact that you keep mentioning 35 is very appropriate. though we are also very impatient. We don't want to wait 35 years for the good things to happen. We are hoping, whether we are betting or not, but we are hoping that good things can happen in somewhat faster time periods than that. But I just wanted to thank Pablo once again for organizing and leading the panel, to both of you for being here, for giving us, for the audience and all of you, a very rich and important discussion. What we do here at the Pardee Center is exactly what you've talked about, trying to think about ways in which development can sustain and be made sustainable. So we are very thankful to the Dutch Ministry of Agriculture, Nature and Food Quality for sponsoring this series of seminars and publications that should be coming out soon, and to all of you for giving us a wonderful, wonderful discussion. As I had mentioned earlier, there's a little gift in front of you for all of you to remember us by. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.